record on this computer? Didn't tell me I was recording. I must have turned off that function. Recently, the Zoom has been saying you are recording. Anyway, my name is Ann Nutter-Kaufman. Good evening. Thank you for joining us this evening. We are recording this particular webinar, as you can see, which is our second in our 2021-22 school year. It took me a minute. I got to switch my lingo a little bit. We are really excited that you have joined us tonight. We can offer a certificate for attendance and professional learning credit, but we'll talk about how to do that at the very end. Okay, so I'm going to pass it off to our NEA Executive Committee member, Hannah Vandering. Hannah?
Thank you, Ann, and good evening, everyone. I'm Hannah Vandering. I'm an elementary physical education teacher from Oregon and proudly serve on the NEA Executive Committee. And we'd like to start our meeting, as we begin all of our meetings, by acknowledging that we all, no matter where we are across this country, meet on the traditional land served by America's First People. We honor America's First People and all elders past, present, and emerging. The Portland metro area, where I reside, rests on the traditional village sites of the Multnomah, Wasco, Cowlitz, Clackamas, bands of Chinook, Tualatin, Kalapuyan, Malala, and many other tribes who made their homes along the Columbia River. Indigenous people have created communities and summer encampments to harvest and enjoy the plentiful natural resources of the area for the last 11,000 years. We want to recognize that Portland today is a community of many diverse Native peoples who continue to live and work here. We respectfully acknowledge and honor all Indigenous communities, past, present, and future, and are grateful for their ongoing and vibrant presence. We also acknowledge the systemic policies of genocide, relocation, and assimilation that still impact our Indigenous and Native American families today. As settlers and guests on these lands, we respect the work of Indigenous leaders and families, and we pledge to make ongoing efforts to recognize their knowledge, creativity, and resilience. We also commit to continue to learn and share what we learn about the tribal history, culture, and contributions that have been suppressed in telling the story of America. And if you'd like to share the Native peoples where you reside in the chat, that would be great. I want to again thank you for joining us. This is, as Ann shared, this is our second of our amazing national series for this school year. And we are so fortunate tonight to have Crystal and Jeff with us, two amazing member leaders who are going to present. This webinar is one way that NEA is trying to support our members in their professional work. We continue to reach out and find new and innovative ways to support you in your professional practice. So thank you for joining us. Last year, as we all know, was difficult and very different. Some might say a weird year. And many are approaching this year with trepidation, but a dedication to our students. And that's why we so appreciate you being here tonight, because the topic for tonight's webinar is relevant to remind us all how to engage in person with our students from the beginning of the school year to build the relationships that will help us move forward and create the learning atmosphere our students deserve. As a reminder, through this series, NEA, we are not endorsing any particular product or platform. There'll be lots discussed, but instead these webinars are an opportunity for members to talk about tools and platforms that they've used that work for them in their teaching space and share those with you. As you know, members are our experts, and all of our NEA national webinars are led by experienced members and staff. And our staff support our work in ensuring that we have all of the support for our members to do these incredible trainings. So thank you to our staff for that. We'll also ask you at the end, as always, right? There's always some kind of evaluation because that's how we learn and get better. So there'll be a short evaluation at the end of this training tonight. And we'll also ask you to identify any additional topics that you're interested in us presenting. So I know that Crystal and Jeff are prepared and ready, so I'm going to pass it off to the experts who are going to lead us through tonight's training. Crystal and Jeff, thank you.
Thank you, and thanks for that warm introduction. As always, we're really happy to be here and really happy to talk about these issues that are near and dear to us, which are about designing for care and building and maintaining that humanized classroom, not just on day one, but really for the entire 180 days that we're with students. My name's Jeff Austin. I am an instructional coach, an English department chair, and a writing center director from Skyline High School in Ann Arbor, Michigan. I've been in teaching for around 15 years, and I've been in several different Michigan districts. And this is something that I've really thought a lot about and done a lot with. So I'm really, as I said, excited to be here talking to you tonight about these things that mean so much to me. Adrienne Marie Brown, we'll come back to her a little later, and actually a lot during this presentation. But she says big changes start small, and I really firmly believe that. So let's make this a space where we can think about how we can take together the most elegant next step in our journey to create schools and classrooms that are humanizing and deeply caring for all of our students. Crystal?
Thank you. My name is Crystal Jaskalainen. I'm Ms. J to the students because that's a big, long Finnish last name. I'm actually at home in the Upper Peninsula, and that's where I'm coming to you for this webinar from. And so you might hear my Yooper accent a little bit more this evening, Jeff. I find that I elongate my vowels when I go home for any amount of time. But thank you for taking the time. Thank you for being here. Thank you for watching this. I've been a teacher for over 20 years, all of them in Ann Arbor Public Schools. Jeff and I actually met at Skyline High School as English teachers together there. And about 4 years ago, I had the opportunity to go, I call it home, to my small alternative high school, also in Ann Arbor. And Jeff and I have long been thought partners and collaborators in this work. And I'm thankful to him for being out in front of me and for being a colleague that I can go to, that inspires me, that makes me better. And you're going to get a lot of that from him today. And again, thank you for being here with us.
Thanks, Crystal. I really appreciate that. That's very nice. And our contact information is on the screen. So please, as you think about that, don't hesitate to contact us. We are here, as Crystal said, to be with you and thought partners with you. So keep those things in mind as we go forward here this evening. So Crystal and I found it really important as we present to be very open and honest about our beliefs, our values, and our assumptions when we enter a space like this. It's important to know where people are coming from, and it's important to know what kind of philosophical standpoints and beliefs we have that are going to bring tonight's webinar to life. So I'm going to have Crystal actually talk to us a little bit about what we can expect tonight.
Thank you, Jeff. So tonight's webinar is about care, and it's about making the classroom a truly humanizing space. And we start with the belief that everyone deserves care, that no one is exempt. You'll hear a lot tonight about this concept of deservedness, and picking that apart and examining where it exists in our policies and in our practices, because we need to begin with the standard belief that everyone deserves care. Kaba talks about stress, scarcity, and oppression as some of the root causes of harm and enemies of care. So where can we look in our practice and our pedagogy to think about ways in which we are perpetuating some of these causes of harm. Too often we think, right, we're teachers, we love kids. Of course, we have a safe space. Relationships are at the center of our pedagogy. So tonight will be challenging in places to pick at the places where our practice perhaps doesn't meet up with that value that we so commonly articulate. Care is very, very, very complex as a concept. It's not just, it seems almost too simple to say in the title, but you'll hear so much tonight and you'll get a lot of definitions. You'll get a lot of the voices that have been talking about this work and have been invested in making our classrooms these humanized spaces. And yes, it is hard work. That is tiring. It is, the word efficiency isn't something that's going to guide your beliefs around care. And if you ever come to webinars with Jeff and I, we talk often about the edges. And that's where you start to feel that discomfort, because tonight is not a how-to. We're not going to tell you about to stand at your door and smile and greet every student. That is a great practice. But tonight isn't a set of how-tos that you can take going into the fall. It's actually going to force you to think about your own practice and pedagogy, and then all the way to advocacy and systemic levels. What do we need to change in our systems and in our institutions to make them equitable, caring, humanizing places and spaces? And I already mentioned it, but finally, our webinars tend to cause discomfort. And we actually, that's exactly where we want you to lean in those places where you're like, but what about, or what if, or but, absolutely. Those are the edges. That's exactly where we need to start pushing and challenging and using our dreams and imaginations to rethink what school can look like, because it traditionally hasn't worked for all of our students. And these are frameworks and ways to think about how to make our spaces and places and schools inclusive for all students. And as Jeff said, we're here to support you. So please don't hesitate to reach out to us throughout and after. We are now thought partners together. Jeff, would you talk a bit more about our values and assumptions?
Absolutely. So a couple of weeks ago, Sean Michael Morris said, love in pedagogical work is an orientation. It's a commitment to the personhood of learners, to their intersectionality, to their deep emotional backgrounds, to the authenticity of their lives. And I think that's a really good place for us to start this webinar and a really good lens to have as we enter into this conversation this evening. Crystal and I believe that the practices and policy should always start with, from, and for the margins. Caesar McDowell's tent analogy works here. When we stake a tent, we don't stake it from the center, we stake it from the periphery to be sure everyone is covered. This work also helps us ensure that we're practicing at small levels what we hope to see at large levels. If we hope to see caring, marginally designed schools, we have to start with our own self-reflection and our own practices in our own classrooms. Crystal and I also believe that when we build caring environments, we help ourselves, our colleagues, our community, and most of all our students imagine education differently, which can disrupt cycles of harm. Just because future environments may employ harmful practices doesn't mean that we should. Preparing students doesn't need to mean perpetuating harm. We believe that we should prepare them and to expect and create something different for themselves and our world. For this webinar, it's also important to consider some of the negative reactions to care. Care has a long history of being gendered and racialized, which means it's tended to be devalued in our society, especially the kind of care that we'll be talking about here tonight. We're hoping to push back on some of those ideologies and biases, and honestly, that's some of the most important work that we'll be doing in this webinar this evening. So again, thank you for being here. And as Crystal said, feel free to reach out, but we want you to know that this is where we're coming from. And these are the value orientations on which this presentation is built. Crystal, you want to take them through tonight's agenda?
Absolutely. We have 3 parts for you. You're going to be steeped in some of the definitions of care, apply it to your own practice. What does it mean? What does it look like? What are you walking into this webinar already thinking? And then Jeff's going to break down some of these more nuanced ways of thinking about this concept of care, relational, virtuous, non-examples. Then we're going to be thinking about models and examples in practice in our schools. How do we build sanctuary spaces? What do these concepts mean as they apply to our own practice? And then finally, and we need to leave enough space for it tonight, Jeff, is advocacy, because this work is personal, but it's also systemic. So the final thing we always do in our webinars is think about, okay, yes, we can apply this in our own classrooms, but how can we be advocates and push these out to a broader audience of all of our constituencies, our students, our parents, our schools, our school boards, our districts, and that you're joining us here at the NEA, right? We have that collective power. How can we use it? And we'll be closing with some fabulous quotes, and that's what we have for you this evening.
One of the difficult parts, as Crystal has just noted, about caring creating environments is that it requires both personal and systemic action simultaneously. We've got a couple of texts here by some amazing authors that can help us navigate the complexity of care by helping us answer the two questions in the upper left part of the screen, which is, how does each student know they're in a caring relationship with you? And how does each student know they're in a caring environment in your classroom and school? Those are really important questions. Those are questions that, if we're being honest with ourselves, force us to unpack quite a bit about our own practices, the environments and systems in which we work and in which we're complicit, and the things that are needed to shift those systems to be more caring and to be more humanizing. One of the things that I want to just share really briefly, as I said earlier, is this idea of emergent strategy by Adrienne Marie Brown. Adrienne Marie Brown's from Detroit. She's local to us here. And it's hard to imagine my practice without emergent strategy. Adrienne Marie Brown and these organizing principles have really shaped what I do and how I do it, particularly over the last couple of years. Brown's organizing principles, if you haven't read Emergent Strategy, remind us of the capacity to imagine a different future together. One where, as I've said a couple of times already tonight, where the micro informs the macro. One where interdependence is a strength. I'll be talking about that a little bit more later. And one where relational care is centered. And so much of Adrienne Marie Brown's work informs the work that we're going to do here tonight. So if I had to encourage you to pick up one of these texts, they're all wonderful, but if I had to encourage you to pick up one, it's Emergent Strategy. Crystal, what sticks out for you on this slide?
I always pick Jessie Stomel. Although I'm gonna say, if you haven't read anything by Bell Hooks, absolutely pick up Bell Hooks. But speaking to my heart, especially through this pandemic and thinking about blended learning and how do we create communities and spaces through the screen and with one another, especially when all of the rest of the world seems to be pulling us apart or keeping us separate. So Jessie Stomel is one of my most favorite voices to read and find out, how can I keep care and my relationships at the center of my teaching, even if it is still across Zoom, even if it is in this blended learning environment. So Jessie Stomel, but again, if you haven't read Bell Hooks, absolutely go grab her.
Those are just a couple on this slide. Really, everything here is worth your time, but we know there's a lot to get through. So those are a couple of endorsements that we have. All right, I want to take a minute here to turn our attention to defining care, which is a little bit weird because, we all think that we do care and we know what care is, but actually, as we've said already tonight a couple of times, care is really complicated. So when you get down into it, there are some really important nuances that I think we need to tackle. So I'm thinking, Crystal brought up what we've been through over the last year and a half or so. And my school, probably like your school, poured a lot of time and energy into getting students to turn in work over the last 18 months. In fact, I would argue that turning in work became the dominant frame for how we talked about and enacted care, at least in my context. Getting students to turn in work is important. I'm not going to dispute that. But I think it also reveals the double-edged nature of care that we see on this slide. Whether students turn in work or not, whether they have an A or an E, shouldn't determine whether they experience relational care in schools. But again, in my context, the focus on turning in work made care conditional. You could hear it in the language that folks used around the building, both virtually, the virtual building when we were there, and the physical building when we came back to school. If we develop relationships with students, they're more likely to do their work. And I can't spend any more time on students who don't want to learn. As I said, these are real quotes that I actually heard this past year. Students had to earn our care by reaching our standards for virtuous behavior. And our standards for virtuous behavior, as I said, became the drivers of our care. Determining who is deserving of care, I think, puts us in dangerous territory. Each student deserves our care, and they deserve it without conditions because they're humans within our community. Care rooted in compliance isn't really care at all. Care rooted in compliance is a transaction. It's not so much that content is incompatible with care, but our choices at philosophical, habitual, and personal levels, which we'll talk about in a moment, can make it incompatible. We can and need to imagine what care looks like beyond the virtuous. Students will set boundaries, and quite frankly, it's healthy when they do. Boundaries are an act of self-care, and respecting boundaries is an act of caring for. We might not like the boundaries our students set, but we need to figure out how to respect them. Going back to Adrienne Marie Brown, she says, if you respect my no, you'll benefit more from my yes. This webinar is designed to help us consider how we can embed relational care into our classrooms at every level, from our philosophy to our daily practices to our personal interactions. This ensures that care is both present at personal and systemic levels simultaneously. A humanizing education really needs to focus on this idea of innate human worth. Now might be an important time also to mention that caring for students is also caring for ourselves, because our well-being is so intertwined. And seeing our fates and our liberation as collective is an important step to designing and maintaining a humanized environment. Miriam Kaba, who we talked about a little earlier, we'll bring her back. She writes, a practice of care, practice of abolitionist care underscores that our fates are intertwined and that our liberation is interconnected. I want to talk about this before we move on, and I turn it back over to Crystal, because I think that this is also critically important for our conversations about care. If you haven't read Alex Vanette's book, Equity-Centered Trauma-Informed Education, I think what you're seeing here is one of the highlights of the book. And I think it's important anytime we talk about care. So it's this idea of a savior mentality, which quite frankly is easy to slip into. I think this is particularly important for Crystal and I to address, particularly as two white, middle-class, able, neurotypical teachers. Classrooms and schools situated in savior mentalities are not helpful for us, and they're definitely not helpful for our students, even if they might appear that way on the surface. A savior mentality tends to develop when our good intentions meet our implicit biases and deficit mindsets, causing us to want to save kids or fix broken students. There's a lot of ways that this can look, and I know that it can be easy to slip into these things, which is why it's important that we're aware. Sometimes the savior mentality might look like us thinking that a student with trauma must not have caring adults in their lives. Other times it might mean holding lowered expectations for marginalized students. And it might even mean thinking that we're the only person who can understand a student or know what they're going through. Savior mentalities can show up in our language, our feedback, and of course our actions. This exemplifies why enacting the relational care that I was just talking about does not mean acting uncritically or giving up on our professional boundaries. To avoid enacting a savior mentality, it's important to confront our deficit-oriented narratives about students, which is something that Crystal will talk about in a moment, including the language we use to talk about them. It requires us to deeply understand our privilege and how it operates. and to consider how we can help students have a network of caring adults in their lives that believe in their inherent worth, their capacity to heal, and their ability to dream. We could do a whole webinar on this, but again, check out Alex Manet's work if you want more. So now I'm actually going to turn it over to Crystal because she is going to give us some real life personal examples of what happens when relational care isn't enacted in an environment and what the outcomes of that are. So Crystal, I'm going to give you the floor here.
Thank you so much, Jeff. Oh, so that slide is an addition from the last time we did it. So it's the first time I've even gotten to hear fully Jeff go through it. And it's so imperative. As I said, I work at an alternative school. And what that means is that we serve students that, for whatever reason, a multitude of reasons, weren't finding success at the larger comprehensive high schools in my local area. A few other common statistics. My students, we serve about 125 to 150 students. Generally speaking, over the course of my time there, we're always about 80 to 90% of our students are free and reduced lunch. About 75 to 85% of our students are students of color. So they represent everything that all of the research that you see on the right pushes. They're the kids that get pushed out. But the savior mentality could come upon and say like, "Oh, it's scary." So I'm going to give a little bit more detail about pathways, how it connects to this concept of the school to prison pipeline, and hopefully some methods to reframe ways that we can think about our own language in our own scenarios and how we talk about students and how we exclude and push out students. All of those resources on the right, absolutely great. If there's time, I'll briefly talk about a couple of them. But first, I want to personalize it to your own practice. And I want you to think about the students that maybe get kicked out of your class or have been excluded from your school or your program. Those are the kids that wind up with me and the staff at Pathways. And the number one thing that they say they all share is that they've had school related trauma, that they have experienced a lack of care in our schooling systems, that they have felt excluded from their home school, the comprehensives of Ann Arbor Public Schools. And my students aren't the only ones who feel this way. There are narratives about my students. Those are the narratives that they say about our school. About what school does to them. Nationwide, students missed more than 11 million days of school due to discipline. That is one area we can absolutely rethink and reimagine. Disproportionate discipline accounts for about 1/5 of the difference in school performance between Black and white students. And when you start going down this road of examining disproportionate discipline policies, ooh, it's a picture you can't unsee. So how does that relate to my school? How do students still get to us? Generally, it's a sentence, it's a punishment, it's a threat, it's used as a threat or a sign of failure. So the counselors or the administration at our other schools, even if they feel like they have the right intentions, use Pathways as a threat. Oh, if you don't do this, then you're going to have to go to Pathways. And that narrative then seeps into the belief of my students. They'll even speak about the way that at graduation, Pathways I thought was for the bad kids. How have we taught that narrative to our own children? Dr. Richard Milner actually did a series with Ann Arbor Public Schools last spring, and he said that a Black boy is safer going to school anywhere else in the state of Michigan other than Ann Arbor because of the disproportionate suspension and expulsion rates that occur in my district. Very affluent, very educated, Jeff can talk about all of the great awards that Ann Arbor Public Schools is known for. And yet this is the narrative that we do to a certain segment of our students. And that's the non-care. That's exactly what we want to push back on. So how can we reframe these narratives from the systemic level all the way down to how our students feel about themselves? We need to rethink our concepts of punishment and consequences and move into restorative is gaining lots of traction, but it has to be, it's restorative is more than just a how-to as well. Restorative is a mindset and a whole systems approach. And then you can push all the way into, as Jeff and I would hope, into concepts of transformative justice. We need to move away from feeling these who deserves what, giving zeros because the student doesn't deserve, into this concept of relational care, that just because you're human, we are in relationship with one another, and care needs to be at the center of that. And finally, it's no surprise, we need to stop excluding students from our programs and our schools and our buildings and think about ways in which we can maintain inclusion and keep our community together as a whole. Check out all of those resources if this is an area that you are interested in. And if I could highlight one, I think I've purchased Just Mercy by Brian Stevenson 75 times, and there's not a copy in my house because I just keep giving it away. Check it out. It's absolutely powerful. And over to you, Jeff.
Thanks. So on that note, we want to talk about how you enact relational care to avoid what Crystal was talking about. Crystal's example may seem extreme, but as those statistics and studies show, this is a fairly common practice that happens in schools every day. So we really need to consider it. In Radical Softness as a Boundless Form of Resistance, B. Oakley, who it's another one. It's difficult to think about my practice without thinking about B. Oakley. But B. Oakley talks about sanctuary spaces as being defined by the person needing sanctuary. And that brings us to the challenging part of care. It both requires us to acknowledge and attend to the individual contexts of each student. As Mies Emad says, while also thinking systemically about how to enmesh care in the cultural fibers of our spaces. This requires us to think and act at three levels: the philosophical, the habitual, and the personal. When we're practicing care at all three levels simultaneously, that's when we can create humanizing sanctuary spaces. As Crystal mentioned in one of the opening slides, harm is situated in stress, scarcity, and oppression. And schools can be places, if we can imagine it and do it, to be able to push back against that. Oftentimes, as Crystal just led us through, it helps to start with some non-examples. So it helps to think about what environments that may be inhospitable look like at each of these levels. So, an inhospitable environment in the philosophical underpinnings level might be an overly bureaucratic syllabus that you present kids with on the first day, and that's really where they enter your room and your class. That sends a message. It really does speak volumes. With habitual practices, we might talk about community building that starts that first week of class, but then never happens again at any point. One of the points we'll make later is that we can never assume that community is built. It needs to be rebuilt every day. And then in our personal interactions, we might talk about forcing students to disclose their trauma in order to get a vote of relational care from us. So we don't want to have students have to perform trauma in order to receive the relational care that they should get because of their innate human worth. Crystal quoted bell hooks earlier, or brought bell hooks up. I want to bring bell hooks up again because one of the things that's really important here is that when you center care, you're going to be at odds with your institution a little bit. Your power structure is going to push back. So when you run into roadblocks or pushback or dissonance, it's important that you keep going. And as Crystal said earlier, again, we will talk about advocacy a little bit later and how we can band together to create a more broadly caring system. But don't quit when you run up against the status quo. those are the edges that you need to lean into. That's where the work is. So that's really, really important. So Crystal, what stands out to you on this slide? These are some actual examples, some good examples, some examples that you could enact at each level. What's popping out on the screen to you?
Absolutely. I will say the philosophical shift and author that I have to give all the credit to is Dr. Goldie Muhammad and Cultivating Genius, and shifting from that deficit, shifting from that deficit language and discovering and spending time intentionally to discover the genius and the strengths that our schools that maybe we didn't recognize, haven't traditionally recognized in all of our students. So that final bullet, right? Presuming that students are competent, capable, and willing to learn, start each student's story with genius. Absolutely. Like that shift alone changes the world. What stands out to you, Jeff?
You know, I'm going to shift over to the personal responses category. And because this is also, Crystal and I also do a webinar about rethinking grading. And actually, these two webinars really do intersect in a lot of ways. I want to point out the last bullet there about the idea that equity and fairness doesn't revolve around a single standard, right? And I think that's really important to remember, right? That there is no single standard that is going to meet all of your students and be responsive to them. And we'll talk more about that in a moment, but I think that's a really critical point to remember. And I think it intersects with that idea of deservedness again, right? Where if you have this single standard that only people who meet that are eligible to get cared for, then you're, one, obviously excluding a lot of students, but also you're imposing values and conditions. And again, that's a transaction.
Absolutely. And I know we only said one, but we have to, I just can't, I even put it in the chat too, like, especially with the start of the school year coming. Too often we'll spend, the first day or two and say, oh, we built community, right? And I love that concept that community, we can't assume that community is ever built. So how are we continuously building in routines and activities to purposefully maintain and increase the relational community in our classrooms all throughout the year, beyond the first day or the first week?
Yeah, again, never assume that community is built. Continue to do that work all the time. Again, it's not necessarily you choosing content or building community, by the way. I think both can be done simultaneously. All right, good. So those are some examples. Feel free to return to this slide, if you need some ideas as we start school again. All right. Crystal knows this about me. I'm a storyteller. It's a big part of my pedagogy and practice. And I think it's also a meaningful way to start practice sharing vulnerability appropriate, safely, and at the speed of trust. So I'm going to tell a story here tonight that I think wraps into how my students and I enact care in our classroom. So I grew up about 15 minutes north of Detroit, and after my dad died, my mom remarried. My stepfather is and was a big sports fan, and in the early 1990s, the Red Wings, our professional hockey team, started to win consistently. We gave ourselves the nickname Hockey Town. I don't know that you can give yourself a nickname, but we did. My uncle has had Red Wings season tickets dating back to the late Gordie Howe years. And so he would give my stepfather tickets to a few games each year, and we drive down. Up until 4 years ago, the Red Wings played in the building that you're seeing on the screen, Joe Louis Arena. And I'm not going to dive into municipal politics tonight or the host of issues with publicly funded sports arenas. But this building was built very hastily, and honestly, it was one of the worst structures to ever be built. It definitely did not befit the name Joe Louis. Just to highlight this, the building didn't even have a press box because they didn't include it in the design. The worst part of the building, though, was how inaccessible it was in so many ways. In the design and building phase, nobody stopped to think about why building 36 concrete stairs is the only way to the arena's public entrances was a bad idea. If you couldn't climb the stairs, you had to find your way around the building into the bowels of the stadium to the retrofitted accessible entrance. Jay Dolmage calls buildings like Joe Louis technically accessible, but the reality is that most retrofits are not really that accessible at all. Most schools are not built with caring for as their foundational bedrock value. But as we said tonight, over the last 18 months, many school leaders and teachers have felt the urgent need and importance of putting it at the center. This requires reshaping systems, structures, practices, and as educators and leaders, we all know the time, effort, and patience that takes. Centering care is both immediately urgent and something that can only be accomplished at the speed of trust. This takes investment in community and learning to be in conflict. It demands, again, as Adrienne Marie Brown says, being in the right relationships with one another. These social and cultural costs of reshaping school and district programs to center care have unfortunately led us to a lot of retrofitting. PBIS programs, SEL lessons, and even the implementation of many quickly implemented, potentially poorly thought out restorative justice programs. Instead of tearing down the stairs and starting again, this time with care in mind, we continually work around with Band-Aids and half measures. When we aren't careful, thoughtful, and intentional in our design, these retrofits can actually double down on the very injustices and oppressions we're trying to eliminate. We can't just add an elevator around the back and call it good. Can't just add a couple of SEL lessons and say we're doing it. In fact, poorly implemented retrofits often encourage us to directly ignore what we need to confront. We might consider how we've been treated as teachers as a useful parallel. Care isn't ice cream at the staff meeting. It's a nice thing, but it isn't care. Care is about philosophical, habitual, and personal systems recognizing our fullest humanity. Every student needs to be able to come through the front door of our schools as their fullest selves and be cared for, not just cared about. Again, PBIS, SEL, restorative justice can all be useful and effective, but their ability to be positive forces depends on how they're situated in a larger ecology of care. It's important to acknowledge that tearing down the stairs can seem overwhelming, both in our classrooms and in the broader systems in which we work. But removing these barriers is critical to building the kind of caring schools we should have been investing in prior to the pandemic. Tonight, Crystal and I are both going to share a few ways that our students have, both urgently and over years, remade our classrooms from the core, ditching the retrofits and half measures, and busting down the stairs. So one of the ways at the philosophical level, my students and I have worked together to enact relational care in our setting is to embed care as a core value. This sounds really simple, but as you can imagine, this is difficult. One of the issues with pandemic teaching was centering the experience around curriculum rather than care, because curriculum is what we know. It was an anchor in a choppy sea. The expectation of consistency did anchor us, but as Sean Michael Morris said, our students didn't find the help their hearts needed. A great curriculum is important and vital, but it's only good as the ecology in which it's situated. Again, Cornelius Miner's ideas, deservedness pops up. When care isn't part of our universal design in our classrooms and schools, decisions get made about who gets cared for and who gets cared about. Before this past year, I worked with Crystal and a few other great teachers from our district, and we designed a model unit that would help our teachers say a proper hello to their students after not being able to say a proper goodbye in March 2020. The unit prioritized sharing vulnerability, building in opportunities for mutual support, and emphasized building brave spaces. It laid important foundations and gave important models throughout the year to humanize instruction. Our model removed the bureaucratic barriers that often get featured in our courses, like grading scales and late work policies. And we spent time talking about how to do something different, compassion. We wanted to give students what their hearts needed. I'll quote Crystal's favorite here, Jessie Stomel, to say that our students need less banal reasons to do things than points. The next thing we do is create a caring community. In a recent keynote, Julio Torres says, the next frontier in education is helping students honor one another's humanity. Unfortunately, our systems and structures really aren't built for these kinds of interactions. School is usually about individual achievement and competition. So we need to help students imagine and map a different future by creating systems of mutual support. Tearing down the steep steps of deeply embedded scarcity mindsets and replacing them with abundance is some of the most exceptionally difficult work that students are being prepared for, but it is the work that we need to prepare them for. They're prepared all the time for the next test, the so-called real world, but rarely are they prepared to be in caring community with one another. And we can shift that. One of the things that we do in my classes is organize into house groups, which makes the large feel small. They provide spaces for students to practice support and mentoring one another, and they offer chances to provide care in micro ways. We can't expect students to enact care or to honor one another's humanity without practicing it in small ways first. And then finally, a lot of this is really built on consent-based classrooms. So much of having a care-based classroom is really building a culture of active consent. This is difficult within cultures of compliance. Active consent isn't just giving students voice and choice, though that's part of it. Students have to be able to practice, as I said earlier, setting healthy boundaries with us and their classmates. They have to be able to comfortably say no. They have to be able to tell you about their access needs and capacities. They have to be able to apologize, to be accountable, and to remain part of the community. This doesn't always end up with students doing what we tell them to do or what we want them to do, but that's okay. Part of moving to a care-based humanized classroom is rejecting a need for total control. There's no stock approach to any of this, but we do know this: when the 36 stairs don't permit access, we exacerbate existing inequities while creating new staircases. For things to change, the material conditions have to change. In 2017, the Red Wings finally played their last game at Joe Louis Arena, and they moved to Little Caesars Arena down the road. And now Joe Louis is being torn down stair by stair. The new arena features wide, street-level entrances around the building and hasn't shown the need to be retrofitted. Everyone can come through the front door on Woodward Avenue without navigating a service entrance to get to their seats. The new arena is a testament to what we can do when we design and put our energy and effort into inclusivity and universality, when we put our effort into structures of care. The pandemic accelerated these efforts to remake our system. Our stairs imploded whether we were ready for it or not. And now we're obligated to rebuild our systems, putting care at the core, even if others want to rebuild the stairs that fell. I think one thing we can all agree on is that nobody should be dependent on a retrofit. Chris, I'm going to turn over to you to talk about the things that you're doing at the philosophical, habitual, and personal levels.
Absolutely. Like I get so excited with this opportunity this fall. On some hand, it's scary, right? But we can't. We have an opportunity to rebuild and redesign and rethink. And I don't want to any longer retrofit or go back to, the simple 36 stairs up to every single one of our schools. So I hear that, Jeff, and I'm going to shift. I'm going to start at the bottom, because the things I've been thinking about in my practice is how can I shift. And Jeff, you talked about this, right? How can I shift from concepts of control and compliance into co-construction and engagement, right? How can I shift from me at the center to our community at the center? And part of that starts with this idea, and I actually learned it early, about power struggles and apologies. It does not mean. I was taught as a little kid that the adult was always right, and so shifting that in my brain once I became an authority was a little bit problematic for me. But I learned early, you're not giving away power. You're actually gaining relational trust, and you're de-escalating situations when you can say, "Oops, I'm sorry. I apologize." So the reframing of that piece for me has really shifted those concepts of control and compliance for me into more relational care. Additionally, the problematic assumptions, especially as a white woman teacher, what we provide may not match what students want or need. And I always give an example of a fellow colleague who was providing rides for students to an after school event, but a student didn't want a stranger coming in to pick him up. And there was this disconnect between what she was providing, which she thought was an equitable access to her evening event, and what the student felt comfortable with, and they didn't match. As I move up into my own habitual practices, check out rethinking grading, which Jeff and I also do together. And I've developed this gamified process of grading that I call progress points. So it's still playing the ABCDE game, not E, but the ABC game. But students, kind of like Candy Crush, are progressing through levels by earning points. So it's flipping that too often deficit problem that happens in grading, right? Where we punish mistakes with lesser grades, even if we want students to take risks. And it says, no, you're gaining points for everything. Also habitually conferencing and building time into conference. Jeff and I both do it in our practice. He's at a much larger classroom size than I have. We both build it in. It is absolutely the one most important piece of pedagogical shifts that I have made over the past 4 years to improve the way my classroom demonstrates care to all of my students. And I already mentioned her, but philosophically, Dr. Goldie Mohammed's Cultivating Genius, right? She says genius is the brilliance, intellect, ability, cleverness, and artistry that have been flowing through our students' minds and spirits across the generations. And I always say with this, we use such deficit language to talk about our most vulnerable students, right? We use things like at risk and struggling. My district called them the bottom 30. Like, I always say, if I could cuss, I would cuss right now, because who calls children the bottom 30? Uh, and why do we do that, right? And it's really because too much of our framework actually neglected to value the strengths and the genius that our students were already coming to us with. So definitely check out Cultivating Genius. And back to you, Jeff.
Thanks. And if you come to one of Crystal and I's webinars, you will always get the advocacy component at the end, because it is so important that we level up. And on that note, one of the really important things here is understanding our interconnectedness and how we can work together to make the changes that we need to make sustainable and viable in the long term. And how we give each other the strength to help people create new frames that will help them understand issues, practices, systems differently. Kaba again says care is the antidote to violence. So in their great book, Everyday Advocacy, Antero Garcia and Kathy Fleischer use a framework from Marshall Gans to help us move from the personal to the local, like our school, to the systemic, like our district or state. And we must eventually get to systemic change to make our schools and districts more humanizing and caring for students and teachers, because remember, we're interconnected. That's why Gans's framework that Antero and Kathy use ends with the story of us. So advocacy isn't something that we're typically trained in. There aren't programs or classes that we've probably taken on it. And we're learning on the fly. So that's always easier together. I will say that being an advocate can feel daunting, but I think one of the first lessons that we've talked about tonight, and that we'll bring back here, is that we need to start small and celebrate big. Too often we've been trained to forego our power and our agency, and I think we need to think differently about that to make a change. So there are a few steps that we can take. First of all, we need to identify a concern. One of those concerns might be about overly punitive attendance policies during a pandemic. These can impact grades, make it difficult for students to catch up, and most importantly, maybe impact students' sense of belonging, which we know is critical to their well-being. Next, we can narrow the issue to something that we have agency over. We know that the complexity of attendance policies. But if our school has a policy that students who are absent face detention or grade loss, we might be able to tackle that as a concern because maybe it doesn't align with our broader school values or the rhetoric that we use to describe what our school environment looks like and is. And we can present that to decision makers. And then as we think about our advocacy, we might also realize that different stakeholders are going to need to hear something a little bit different. So we can frame or cut the issues differently depending on who we're talking to. So part of advocacy is learning how to speak other languages and really using what people need to hear to maximize the opportunity for change. Crystal mentioned this earlier, but one of the great parts about being an NEA and being here tonight is that we have built in advocacy networks by being part of the union. It's a good reminder of our collective power. And in many ways, we found our allies. Crystal always likes to talk about finding your people. And so tonight, we'd like to think that hopefully you found 2 more people from your network. All right, cool. With that, we're going to do a real quick exit. Crystal?
Absolutely. So we are going to read aloud each of these 5 quotes, and we'd like to give you just a second to think about which one is resonating with you. And we want you to walk away then thinking about and ruminating on those bottom 2 questions about in what ways is the quote you selected an invitation for shifts in your upcoming school year? And in what ways is the quote you selected a challenge as we come into this fall? Think about existing mindsets, your course design, daily practices, pedagogies, personal interactions with students, and how each quote and the quote that you pick might resonate and help shift your practice. And the first one is by Bali, who said, "Love first, design later."
Quote 2 is when teachers commit themselves to service, we're able to resist the participation in forms of domination that reinforce autocratic rule. The teachers who serves continuously affirms his or her practice that educating students is the primary agenda. That's by Bell Hooks.
Paulo Freire said, "When education is not liberating, the dream of the oppressed is to become the oppressor."
Adrienne Marie Brown again, number 4. Liberated relationships are one of the ways we actually create abundant justice. They understand that there's enough attention, care, resource, and connection for all of us to access belonging, to be in dignity, and to be safe in community.
And finally, we need to design our pedagogical approaches for the students we have, not the students we wish we had. This requires approaches that are responsive, inclusive, adaptive, challenging, and compassionate. This is not a theoretical exercise. It's a practical one. Jessie Stomel and Sarah Goldrick Rad. And we're going to toss it back on that note to, I believe it's Jennifer that's going to be taking us to your picking 4, Idalia.
All right. Thank you so much, Crystal and Jeff. Every time I listen to them, I learn so much. And my mind starts running about all the things that I'm going to do and use from what I've learned today. So thank you. I am going to pass it back to Hannah, who's going to share her reflections for tonight.
Well, I just want to say thank you again to Crystal and Jeff for their incredible work in putting this together. I'm extremely grateful. And every time I'm on one of these webinars, I learn something new. And I really appreciated the shifting from deficit and really lifting up the genius of our students and knowing that creating that community isn't a 2-day at the beginning of the year. It's an ongoing. It's what we do throughout the year because our students need us to do that. And together, we're going to make a difference in the lives of our students. So thank you again to our presenters. I know we're short on time. So Jennifer, I'm going to kick it back to you to share final steps.
All right, so I just put in the chat the link to NEA Storefront. You can find a recording of this webinar in a couple of days, along with a slide deck, and you can print a certificate of attendance, and plus find all the other webinars that we've done in this series, including the one they've been talking about, rethinking grading and assessment, which is awesome. So definitely check it out. And then we listen to what you have to say. If you could go, let's see the next slide. Yes, thank you. We listen to what you have to say in terms of determining what's next. So every webinar in this series is based on requests. So I'm putting in the chat the link to the exit survey. If you could please take a minute to complete that, we really appreciate it. And we're out of time. So thank you so much and have a good night, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you for coming.